Hello, I hope you guys had a great week. I just recorded a Teams meeting for us that really screwed up because I could not get anything to work. So I stopped. I got online with Utah Tech guys and the tech support dudes. They took care of it. They sorted it out. Everything's great, and it looks like I can actually do what I need to do. This is awesome. I don't know if I told you. Last week there was a horrible grinding noise in our video. That was because the computer I was using was making that sound. Absolutely horrible. My heart sank. I thought I'd have to buy a new one. Took it to Best Buy, talked to the Geek Squad, and found out that it was just a couple um, air cooling fans that had gotten out of alignment, and it sounded absolutely terrible. So I'm going to go back and get that taken care of later on tonight, go back to our normal broadcasting situation by next week. And I've just been having a dickens of a time getting things sorted on my new computer, and just got off with William over at um, Utah Tech Support. He took care of me, and I'm ready to go. So, I mean, very, very awesome. If you guys have any issues at all, um, they are really good. They'll walk anybody through. And I guarantee you guys do not have issues like I do because you grew up with this stuff. But it's excellent. Very nicely done. Okay, this week, blah, 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 preamble. This week, we are going to be talking about, we did the world tour. We were doing that. And this week, instead of the world tour, we are going to be now looking at art movements. Now, there's phrases that you're going to hear, and they're going to be used a lot for the rest of the term. Movements and periods. Art movements and art periods. I'm going to give you just a pretty rough kind of definition that we can work with for what makes those two things different, because they are different. Generally, an art period is going to be constrained mostly by time. So people will say from this year to that year was this art period. And it is generally understood to be art from a specific area, from a specific country, or from a specific culture. So we could say an art period might be early Egyptian tomb art. Okay, that's an art period that would cover from maybe 3200 to 2100 BC. Or we could say Harappan civilization art period. And that's going to be the Harappan civilization that was in Pakistan and Western India about 3,000 years ago, and covers a span of about 1,200 years. So generally, art periods are going to be significantly lengthy periods of time as well. So generally a couple hundred years. So if we say Carolingian Renaissance, that's going to be our period from about the mid 8th century, so about 740, 750, to shortly before the First Crusade in 1098. So, and you know, it covers a couple hundred years. We could also say uh, the post-Roman collapse in Europe, it would be another art period, and that would be between 456 and 750 AD. All right, so both of those cases, we do, sometimes our exact years, a lot of the times they're not, but an art period, again, is defined generally by a significant period of time, 50 to a couple hundred years, or more even sometimes. It's also generally going to be bounded by a specific culture and sometimes a country. Those aren't always the same thing. Like the Harappan civilization, they developed a civilization of a lot of city-states. So there were a lot of little tiny countries named after the towns that founded them. And in the current part of the world that they were in is Pakistan into a little bit of Afghanistan and Western India. So even that, it covers several current day countries. But if we say Harappan period, then we know that it's art that is specifically linked to the Harappan civilization over several hundred years. So that's all what an art period is. But for the rest of the term, we're going to be talking about art movements, and that is different. An art period is art that is produced by a culture, so by whoever's in the culture. An art movement is art that is produced by artists that are thinking along similar lines, that are painting or sculpting or building or designing along similar lines. There's a good chance that they were talking together, and they're addressing common interests, or they're reacting to common events. And a lot of the times it's going to be localized, but depending on communication technology of the time, it doesn't have to be localized. Like we'll look at Dada art, which a lot of that happened in Belgium, but a lot of it also happened in the Netherlands. And there was Dada art that was produced for the stage, so stage plays that were Dada, that were produced in the United States and England. So several very different places around the world. And the period lasted for about 20 to 30 years. But that's not entirely accurate, but that's pretty close. There was a group of artists that were pretty aware of each other's work, and they are addressing similar concerns in their art, and their art generally feels like there's a similar flavor to it. It's not the same style, but it's a similar flavor. And the movements will last anywhere from a year or two to maybe 20, 30, 40 years, but generally a lot less than a couple centuries. And the reason why I'm a little bit ambivalent about this is that today there are a lot of young artists that are incredibly talented at what they do, and they are revisiting, with the technology that we have today for creating art, they're revisiting those movements of 50, 100, 150 years ago. And it's really astounding to me. Like, particularly if you guys have any AI artists that you follow on Instagram, they are producing some really fantastic stuff where they are purposely having the AI program look at other art movements and then suggest avenues to pursue and explore. And then these young artists will create art that fits in that movement pretty well. I mean, it's absurd. But we're not going to be talking about that right now. That's going to be at the very tail end of the term. What we're talking about right now are the historical art movements that we do know about that have been quantified. Quantified means measured. So, for example, this module 10, we're going to be talking about Impressionist art. And I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to go through the whole module with you, and then we'll meet back here when I'm done, so you can see my awesome shirt. So give me a second here. There we go. So it looks like you can see my screen. I hope so. This is the Module 10 overview. Now this is a really good example of the kind of art that we're going to be talking about. This is Impressionist style art. Up until now, a lot of the art that we saw was very specific to the different cultures that we looked at. I mean, all of you can identify Japanese or Chinese art now, as long as it fits in that historical context. All of you can identify, like the Jene horsemen, those terracotta structures, the kinds of pots we might find in Ghana or Nigeria, and the kente cloth. You guys are really familiar with that. You know what those art movements or art periods created, and those are art periods, and they're bound by culture, by time, and by a significantly similar society is what they are bound by. Now, as we get into art movements, things are going to be a little bit different. Because instead of looking at how an entire culture views everything and reflects that perspective in the art that they are basically promoting and creating, we are going to be looking at smaller groups of artists within the same culture, generally, who are addressing new ideas in different ways than the people around them. So up until now, a lot of the stuff we looked at, especially with the Renaissance in Italy, was very naturalistic. I mean, it looks almost like a photograph. What is interesting to me is that with the cultural changes that are going on to society as a whole in Europe in the mid-1800s, it suddenly becomes possible for artists to do things that other people don't expect. At this time, there's a couple things that are going on in the world that I think are really important to talk about, and we'll talk about them as we go through the module. But I want you, before we talk about them, I want you to look at this particular painting and think about how this is different than some of the other more naturalistic things that we've seen, particularly stuff that we saw during the Renaissance. And how is it different than the things we saw from Japan and China? Well, there's a couple of things that I will pick out. One is, if we look at the way the paint is put onto the canvas. During the Renaissance, it was really important that people did not see individual strokes of paint. It was considered aesthetically pleasing to have things flow together pretty smoothly. Now we look at this, I mean, it looks like the artist is grabbing up daubs of paint with his paintbrush and mushing them onto the canvas. The strokes are generally not really long and flowing like they may have been for some Renaissance artists, but they look very short. Like these, and these dots, a lot of them suggest something that could be there, as opposed to defining what is there, which I think is really interesting. Those green dots that we see, hopefully you can see my mouse, but across the center of this, we see these green smudges that are kind of like horizontal thumbprints almost, and we see these pink vertical smudges, and some of them are both, but if you kind of blur your eyes a little bit, it does look an awful lot. This whole scene looks an awful lot like maybe something is being reflected in the water's surface, and that blue represents the water. The white may represent a cloud that's being reflected in the water, and those green and red dots, maybe they are out of focus lily pads. And if those are along the lines of what you thought, that's exactly what it is. This is this is a painting that is done by an artist that was really fascinated with how the eyes worked. But this is Claude Monet, and this particular painting is actually called Reflections of Clouds on a Lily Pond. So what he was trying to do was very different than what the other artists that we've been looking at, what they were trying to do. And I'm going to go into a little bit of the history of the time period so that we can get a better idea as to why people are doing this. Now, I do have to warn you that many times people get kind of uncomfortable with impressionistic art. A lot of us are trained to believe that art is only good if it looks like a photograph, which is the way that my grandparents were trained. I mean, that's what they were taught. But as we've spoken about what art is earlier, art is rarely a reflection of what the world is. It's almost always a reflection of how the artist sees the world. We're getting to see what the artist thinks about the world in the paintings or the sculptures or the figures or the architecture that they make. So the Impressionistic period, I'm sorry, I'm throwing that around a little bit, I'm interchanging them around. Impressionism is an art movement. But we will talk about the Impressionist period, and that will be a reference to the time period of Impressionism, of the Impressionist movement. So we're talking about a period of time as opposed to an art period. If we talk, so because Impressionism is an art movement. So hopefully that's not too confusing. And if it is, write me an email and I'll let you whine a bit and then we'll move on. I want you to think about some stuff that's going on. During this time period, the Industrial Revolution had been going on for a while. During the Industrial Revolution, it gave an opportunity for a lot of people to make additional income to what they had been doing already. Maybe they had been working while living on a farm. Maybe they were working in a fishery. Maybe maybe that's what their family did. But now family members could go to factories and generate an income for their families doing non-traditional things, working in a factory. That also meant that there were a lot of companies that were getting really, really big and needed to employ people that were not sweating for their labor. And that's where the term white collar comes from. White collar references the starched collars that people would wear as they are going into the administration of these big factories. Not everybody working has to work with their muscles. Some people have to work with their minds as well. And that's what's going on here. So you have a shift of what it means to provide for your family and to provide for your food, for your table. In addition to that, with the Industrial Revolution producing an awful lot of goods, a lot of material objects for people to buy, there were a lot of shops, a lot of merchants, a lot of salespeople that were making more money because they had more stuff to sell. And there were other people that, because of their families' associations with factories and because of the other work that they were doing, they had money with which to buy. And the economic principles that had been sustaining Europe for centuries were being turned on their heads. No longer did you have to serve in fealty to a lord. No longer did you have to be born into wealth in order to have it. Now, ordinary people that started off as orphans could become wealthy. And this is in several areas throughout Europe. This is what, Lewis Carroll, not Lewis Carroll, sorry. The person who wrote Christmas Carol, what was his name? Charles, oh, that is so funny, I can't remember his name. But he wrote Oliver Twist, he wrote Christmas Carol, A Tale of Two Cities, those books. One of the subjects that he keeps returning to is this possibility that ordinary people could earn a significant income. Charles Dickens, that's his name. I can't believe I forgot his name. There are some other things that are going on that I think are really impressive. Well, and something to think about as well. The technology for regular landline phones hadn't really even gone into wide use at this time. Cars were not really that big of a thing. I think the first internal combustion engine in Europe was actually invented during the 15th century by a Jewish inventor in Prague, but nobody paid any attention to it. Nobody did anything with it. And it wasn't until the end of the 1800s that people started making automobiles or even mopeds or motorcycles, things like that. Motorized transport was still a thing of the future. The first trains were not really in that big of a deal yet. People had just started thinking of the possibilities that trains would procure. So, and that's right before Impressionism. During Impressionism, people have only had, for example, access to trains for about 10 years, 5, 10, 15 years maybe. And overnight, well, you probably won't believe this, but up until about 120 years ago, traveling anywhere took, depending on how you were traveling, you could travel anywhere from 10 to 20 miles in a day. If you were by yourself on a horse, you could go maybe 20 miles in a day. If you had a team, a wagon team, or anything like that, it was going to be like 10 miles. If you had to walk, it was going to be maybe 5 miles. So think about that for just a second. It is about 40 minutes driving time from here to Cedar City. It's maybe about 45, 50 miles. 150 years ago, it would have taken 2.5 days to get there. on a good day, on a good set of days. You add in bad weather, that's it. There's a quote in here that I'm going to share with you in just a little bit, um, that helps you to understand how people's perspectives are shifting. So this is the world that we're inhabiting with these ideas of Impressionism coming in. There are some other things too, but I really like this quote from Van Gogh to his brother Theo. Think about this for a second too. I mean, how many of you have come to the Halloween exhibit for students? It's really good. It's in the North Commons building. How many of you gone to the abstract exhibit over in the Sears Gallery on campus? A lot of the times we can go to exhibits easily online. But imagine taking that long to travel anywhere and not having access to the internet or search engines or anything like that, not even having access to flush toilets. That's how far back we are. Well, Van Gogh said to his brother, when I hear you talk about a lot of new names, it's not always possible for me to understand when I've seen absolutely nothing by them. And from what you said about Impressionism, I've grasped that it's something different from what I thought it was, but it's still not entirely clear to me what one should understand by it. I think that's pretty telling. And this was in 1884 that he wrote that. So that is 140 years ago. People did not have access to information as rapidly as we do today. And I think that's one of the astounding things we have access to is just the ease at which we can access visual information. And most of the artists at this time, if they wanted to see what other artists were doing, they had to travel to a city and go to an actual exhibit. Now, this is an important build-up to what Impressionism is. This is shifts in perception. Now, we talked a little bit how before Impressionism, people were really interested in realism. They were, because paints and painting, it took a lot of training to be a good painter. A lot of people only wanted to commission works that they felt covered important subjects. And I'm saying important with, air quotes, can't see them. But these important subjects were things that reflected religion, rulership, and history, essentially. So important elements from the history of the country that you're in, or the area or the city that you're in. Important stories from the biblical stories, for example. And then the people that were wealthy enough that could afford to commission an artist to come and paint their realistic portrait and stay with them for a week or several weeks. And that limited it pretty rapidly to kings and queens, duchesses and dukes, nobility, royalty, and then really wealthy families, essentially. Now, because I don't know if it's because of it or not, but it seems almost to be related to the idea of the very controlled brushstroke and smoothing painting, was the fact that paint was difficult to procure and to work with and to keep. And so you had to be very careful with what you were doing. You couldn't, quote unquote, be sloppy with your application of paint. You had to be very precise. As we move into an era where there are trains, and then after a short while there become telegraphs where people could communicate vast distances through copper wires. Think about that for a minute. As the speed of travel increases and living conditions increase so that people can live together more healthily, but be a lot closer together, those things all combine at the same time period to create a world that is very different than what the world was 10, 15, 20 years earlier. So before Impressionism, European painters were deeply concerned with realism. or making things true to life. Painters chose subject matter that was quote unquote important. That's history, religion, and rulers. And painters used paint in very controlled ways. Now, as we get into the mid-1800s, and artists are starting to respond to the world around them, and we're going to talk about some innovations that were very important to the artists at the time. European painters during Impressionism became less and less concerned with making things look objectively realistic. They became much more interested in expressing and sharing how they themselves saw the world around them. So it became more about self-expression and a phrase called subjective human experience. Because materials were easier to access and a lot less expensive, they also, artists moved towards more everyday subject matter, more more common or slice of life type subject matters. There's a French word or French phrase, en plein air, which means essentially making it outside. And that was a phrase that was used as artists started going around finding ordinary scenes to paint and to portray, and doing what they felt was sharing the world that they saw through their paintings. And then paintings and paint and materials and tools became a lot less expensive for people to use. So they could do a lot more experimentation as well and try new things that were more fun for the artists to produce. There's a lot of experimentation with texture and application of paint. If you have only a tiny amount of paint to cover a large area, you're going to want to smooth it out as tight as you can. If suddenly you get a whole lot more paint because it's so much cheaper, then you can start really packing it on and give it a physical texture as well as applying areas of color. So we're going to address those differences a little bit at a time. And we already talked about how in beginning of the 1800s, the effects of the Industrial Revolution were really starting to be felt economically and socially. The Industrial Revolution allowed for people to make significant amounts of income when before their families couldn't change their social stations at all. It also allowed people to have different opportunities for work and producing, different kinds of jobs. It wasn't just being a dock worker or a farmer. Now you could also be a bookkeeper. There's lots of different kinds of sources for income. With this, people also moved to different areas. They moved to be close to factories. And there are, Emile Bronte and her sisters lived with their dad in a town that was a factory town that grew so fast that nobody had time to create a sewer system. And so a third of the people in the town got sick because the conditions were so bad. But by and large, people tried to solve those problems so that folks could live in larger communities near factories to have jobs and work and support their families. More goods, more items were being manufactured for people to buy. More people had income with which to buy them. So that changed the perspective on what it meant to be alive, really. And this photo is a guy named Louis Daguerre. He developed the first reproducible, fast-acting photographic process in the daguerreotype. I say that, and you may think it's kind of funny. It did take several minutes for him to produce an image with his daguerreotype system. But considering the fact that the first photo was maybe 25, 30 years earlier, and it took an all-day, 12-hour exposure to create, what he was doing was phenomenal. About the same time, there were other artists working with other ways of developing photographic processes. But with what he was doing is he essentially made it so that almost anybody who wanted to could set up a photo studio and start taking portraits of people. And portraiture, like we just talked about, that was reserved for royalty. So having family portraits taken with a daguerreotype photographic process was a big thing. And people could suddenly get very realistic images in just a few minutes, as opposed to having to sit for a painting for several days or weeks. So that in itself kind of shifts what an artist could do. Now you think, okay, well, they're only black and white, or they're only different shades of amber or red. But in reality, there was quite a lot of people who they would take daguerreotypes, print it onto paper, and then they would use watercolors to color that. So you could have a color image of your family, or whoever you could get to sit still. So photography changed, or helped to change, what people considered important enough to paint, and how people portrayed their painting. Now at this time as well, Japan is opening up to trade in Europe, last part of the 19th century. And people are getting these incredible things that they've never seen before coming over from Japanese shippers. And in that, a lot of these items are wrapped with simple wood block prints that were so common in Japan that people shipping items used it as packing paper. But Europeans started seeing this image right here is of a woman holding her baby. This is not a typical image that a realist painter in Europe before this time would consider doing unless it was a royal portrait. So this is just a mom and her kid. And I think seeing images like this, seeing plant life, flower things, flower arrangements and stuff like that as painting subjects that were acceptable, gave permission for a lot of artists to decide that their work was what they wanted to do was acceptable as well. I'm going to have to cough just a second. Excuse me. All right. Now, as we look at this, you can see that this is one of those Japanese paintings we saw several weeks ago. And it is just of basically branches with leaves and flowers on them. This isn't a monumental historical event. This isn't a biblical story or anything like that. But seeing this, artists are giving themselves permission to paint more and different subjects. Travel technology was a huge thing. And I can, think about that for just a second. I talked about going to Cedar City. The highway, the speed is 80 miles an hour if you want to remain legal, which, to be clear for this class, I always support and endorse everybody behaving so that they remain within the confines of the law, just so that, anybody's going to record this later. When people started developing steam engines for factory use, there were other people that were trying to get those steam engines shrunk down to the point where they could actually use them to pull loads over land. And that's what led to the development of the train. Now, in 1830, there was an actress named Fanny Kemble who had this to say about her experience riding in a train for the first time. And think about the shift of perspective from what we're used to today and what you experienced at that time, almost 200 years ago. The engine set off at its utmost speed, 35 miles an hour, swifter than a bird flies. You cannot conceive of what that sensation of cutting the air was. The motion is as smooth as possible, too. When I closed my eyes, the sensation of flying was quite delightful and strange beyond description. How many of you have gotten frustrated having to slow down to 35 miles an hour? Isn't that amazing? And then during this time as well, with the trains, when you look outside and the landscape is blurry. You even see there's an odd process of a train coming towards you when its size appears to physically change because it's moving so quickly. I remember coming across an article, I wish I could find it now, but somebody was talking about how if anybody ever went over 45 miles an hour, they would probably break the time barrier and go back in time, and that it was an affront against God and creation. I thought that's pretty wild. And can you imagine that right now? Of course, all of us know through rigorous scientific training that the actual time limit to brake, or speed limit to brake time, is 88 miles an hour. We learned that through Back to the Future. But you can imagine not even going about a third of that speed and considering that just astronomical. But people were going so fast, it was hard to focus outside of windows, so everything seemed blurry. And then you also had a rapid change in size from perspective that made things look like they were actually growing. Well, during this time period as well, there are a number of different photographers that are working in different techniques. There was one photographer, I can't remember his name, but the book that he wrote is called The Pencil of Nature. And he talks about a recent discovery regarding atomic particles that you could probably, he thought, capture their image on photographic film, which is fascinating because that's exactly the process that they used in atomic theory and nuclear physics beginning about 50 years after he wrote that, which I thought is amazing. Now, the atomic theory, believe it or not, has been around for at least 3,000 years. That the particles, it's even referenced by one of Paul's speeches in the New Testament. But the philosophers around the time of Socrates and Plato talked about the atomic theory, that every bit of material that we interact with is actually made of just incredibly small particles which link together. So they knew about that, but it wasn't really proved until the 19th century, in the mid-1800s. This, I want you to imagine for a moment what that might mean to somebody, where suddenly you find out that what the things that you feel have been solid have been proved not to be solid anymore. You know, they still function as solids, they still behave as solids, but you have this new scientific awareness that, like on this image on the left, everything is made up of tiny moving particles called atoms. If you're an artist, a painter, we're looking at another blow up of one of Claude Monet's paintings. He's kind of addressing that, I think, a little bit, this new awareness with the kind of smudge painting that he's doing. We go up to the top again, we can see this is from Reflections of Clouds on a Water Lily Pond by Claude Monet. And we can start seeing maybe there's a reason as to why he was making his paints all dotty like that. Maybe he was responding to the ideas that moving so fast, you have to slow the world down in order to get it into focus. Or, you know, people are moving faster across the planet's surface than they ever had before in history that anybody knew about. And then you also have the idea that everything is made up of particles. Well, so those are, and then you also have him responding to the idea of photographs and not being limited to important, air quotes, so-called important themes. So those are a couple of different things to think about. But now I want to also talk about paint technology. Because we talk about technology, we talk about view of the world, we're talking about travel technology, different ideas like that, the Industrial Revolution. There were a couple things that happened in the art world specifically that are pretty fantastic too, and they represent leaps of technology ahead of where people were. And there are two special innovations in the technology of art we're going to talk about. One is the technology of pigment. I'll look at these pigments here. These were the more easily available pigments before the mid-1800s. This is what people had ready access to. Some of the colors, we see a couple greens down here, we see some yellows here, reds. But what's one of the common things that you can see that are shared among all these colors? It looks to me like they're a little bit on the darker side. You know, they're kind of on the dirtier side, the earthy side. I don't want to say dirty in the terms of you need to wash it off, but dirty as in actual dirt. These look like they're made from materials that you would find, that you would scrape out of rocks, essentially. And to be fair, a lot of that was. These are oxidized pigments that are made from minerals. These are the things these are the common paint that people had access to. Well, with the Industrial Revolution, new chemical processes were developed and refined so that people could start getting a different set of colors, an additional set of colors. What is so different about this and that? I mean, we can almost immediately see it. Right here, there's more blues. That's one big difference. But I think the biggest difference is this one, the one that just showed up on the scene in the mid-19th century, the colors are a lot brighter, aren't they? I mean, they're a lot more vibrant. And having access to this was amazing. You know, before this time, you would have to go out, hunt up your own pigments, grind them, and mix them yourself to make your paints. But at this point, you could actually start buying stuff like this that was made because the chemical processes developed for the success of the Industrial Revolution. Now, the other big thing was, and I love this, Renoir said this in the early 20th century, without colors and tubes, there would have been no Impressionism. Think about that for just a second. What could he be referring to? Well, I will tell you. In order to save your paint from drying out, you need to store it in a flexible container that's airtight. For most of our ancestors who did painting before the mid-19th century, that meant getting an animal bladder. A lot of the times it was going to be pig, but not always. Sometimes you could do it with other animals, but most of the time, a lot of the time, it was pig bladders. So not only were your paints darker colors like this for the most part, but you also had to store them in pig bladders. And these were expensive to get. You know, you only had one per pig, essentially. That's all you had to work with. But because of the Industrial Revolution, people were able to process metal into incredibly thin sheets. And art suppliers were able to create tubes that if painters still wanted to mix their own paints, they could put them into the tubes, or they could buy color sets of the paints already in tubes. Suddenly, you had an easy way and cheap way of keeping your paints from drying out and of traveling with them. Now you can start seeing, well, okay, artists not only had brighter colors, but they also had easier access to paints that were cheaper, and they could take them anywhere, when nobody had been able to do that before. So think about that. So of course, you're not restricted to working inside of somebody's house doing portraits or working in a studio to paint Bible scenes or history scenes. Suddenly you can go almost anywhere. And that's one of the reasons why Claude Monet liked hanging out at the pond. He could actually take his stuff and paint there. Manet liked doing some of the same stuff. Van Gogh would go for walks and set up his easel out in the middle of nowhere because artists had the capacity and the ability to do this. Now, if we go back and look at the structure of those paint daubs right here, now this is starting to make a lot more sense too. Okay, maybe he is reflecting on what people see when they move really fast, but maybe he's also reflecting on an awareness that there's atoms everywhere and everything's made up of particles. Maybe he's thinking about other stuff too, but he's able to express what he's thinking in shapes of paint like this because paint is so inexpensive and he can take it anywhere. So, you know, and you also, because of the Industrial Revolution, it used to be that a painter's brush had to be handmade by hair that was harvested and then combed by the brush maker. Now they were made in factories, a lot less expensive. I think that's pretty amazing. So we're going to be looking at the quiz really quick here. The quiz, that's one of the ways that you can increase your grade. Just go back and take whatever quizzes that you need to. You can retake them if you didn't get a perfect score. Oh, I hit the edit instead. That's not what I wanted to do. That's funny. So give me just a second here, and I will change this. We're going to hit the preview button this time, and we're going to go through the questions. So what was one reason Impressionist painting had more movement in it than painting that had come earlier? Well, think about this. What did we talk about? It was an idealistic way of showing that the Impressionists wanted to move away from Europe. That was not even part of the discussion. Brushes were harder to hold. No, we talked about how much less expensive they were to make. Impressionists liked to dance. I mean, that doesn't have anything to do with it either. But what about this? The invention of the train, that had a profound effect on how people moved and how people experienced travel. How their perceptions of the world around them were changed. So think about that for a minute. And how did the discovery of atomic particles impact Impressionist painting? Well, I think if you're told all of a sudden that the world around you is not solid, it's made up of tiny little moving bits, that is going to affect how you look at the world. Impressionists learned physics, although there are nuclear physicists who are also painters. That really doesn't have anything to do with the Impressionist movement. Scientists and artists work together to write new theories? Not necessarily. The painters made images made of little dots of paint? I think that doesn't sound too bad. Paintings took on an atomic charge during Impressionism? No, it's no different. There is evidence of different atomic charge, but that's because of uranium being used in certain colors, believe it or not. Yeah, uranium and phosphorus started showing up in paints. Not really the healthiest stuff to paint with, uranium. But this number 2, the painters made images made of little dots of paint. I think that reflects how they suddenly started thinking about the world. It reflects them coming to terms with the new world that they were forced to confront with the awareness of the fact that atoms were proved. It wasn't just a 3,000-year-old theory. Now, what do you think influenced Claude Monet to make long horizontal paintings? A lot of the times, the paintings here in Europe were based on golden rectangle. They weren't really long and shallow. I mean, they weren't really long horizontal paintings. But remember, people were interacting with Japanese images that were coming over for the first time. And then, having the accessibility to these images gave them new ideas for formatting paintings. So Claude Monet wanted his paintings to be visible from space. I don't even think that was part of his thinking at all. Claude Monet liked trains and wanted to make, well, that isn't even finished, so we're not going to even consider that one. Claude Monet had worked in a factory with big walls and wanted to make paintings to fill them. That doesn't enter into the conversation. I don't think that has anything to do with this either. But Europeans were seeing Japanese images for the first time in the 1800s. I think that has a lot more to do with it, because they were seeing this new Japanese way of formatting images with things like the woodblock prints. So I think that's worth considering. And then what was paint stored in before the invention of metal tubes? Well, plastic wasn't even an issue until significantly later. Socks, I really hope not. Socks are pretty porous and the paint would seep through or dry. Stone cups, well, it's not really storing. You might have, I really doubt that is part of it either. I mean, most of the people that used organic materials to store paints in would store them in seashells because they weren't porous and they were lighter to carry. But you would have to do that with gouache and watercolor. That was a water-based medium that you could re-wet and reuse. Oil is not something you can do that with. So what's the last option? Pig splatters. We just talked about that, didn't we? That the metal tubes replace pig splatters as what the artists go to store paints. When we look at this, before Impressionism, the subject matter of European paintings have been of kings, queens, and important stories like that. With Impressionism, suddenly painters could make paintings of everyday life. Absolutely. Scenes from nature. Absolutely. Mothers and children. Yeah, absolutely. So the correct answer is all of the above. Now, when you write your reflection, I'm trying to get back to, there we go. When you write your reflection, talk about Impressionism, but what I want you to do is consider how and why Impression is different to the realistic painting styles which came before. I want you specifically in this submission to write about one, physical technology innovation. That can be travel technology. That can be awareness of atoms. That could be steam engines used in factories. And I want you to talk about one art technology. And that could be either the new spread of color pigments, how bright they are, or the invention of metal tubes to store paint in. So in your reflection address, to get full points, you'll need to address one technological or travel innovation and one innovation that directly addresses art technology. And then for our studio, we're painting from life, and I only have 15 more minutes, and hopefully get through this sooner than that. But I want you to be aware of this. We're painting from life. You already have a set of paints that you demonstrated that you knew how to use with two of the studio processes that we did earlier. One was that 4-panel painting. Remember that where you folded the paper into 4 areas and then painted. And the other is, or was, the line paintings, where you paint lines thinking about cave art. In this, what I want you to do, this has stressed a lot of people out, but I want to be really, really clear about this. Impressionism was not realism. Nobody was trying to create something that looked like what you could see out of a camera. That was not the point. Impressionism was all about the artist's unique perspective. Think about things like quick dabs of paint. Think about things like bright colors. What I would like you to do to get ready for this is just do a quick Google search on Impressionist painters and just look at their paintings. A lot of them are not very realistic. Manet did a lot of paintings that weren't even close to being realistic. But you will notice that a lot of them did use dabs of paint, dots of paint, and blobs of paint. So what I want you to do is get out of your mind the idea of making something realistic. I do not want this to be realistic. What I do need you to do is look at an object that you decide on long enough that you get a feel for it, and then paint it how you are seeing it inside your head. Don't paint it realistically. That's not what we're interested in. We are interested in exploring the methods of what Impressionist art movement artists were doing. So you get an object. I would say a simple object, maybe not an egg. Those are actually really difficult to paint, believe it or not. But something like a multicolored fruit would be good. Something like a big flower would be good. An object like a toy might be good. Something like that. But think of something about the size of a softball. All right? If you have no idea what else to paint, grab a washcloth and wad that up into a ball and set that in front of you. Ideally, this works really well if you have something that has several colors on, like 2 or 3 colors. Then what I want you to do is get out your paper, sit in front of this object, and spend about 10 or 15 minutes doing a sketch of it. Do the sketch fairly lightly. We don't want you to really carve into the paper. You're sketching the overall shape of the object, but you're also going to be doing lighter sketches of areas that show different color. Like on this pear, maybe your sketch is going to be that outline, overall outline of the pear. You're going to sketch where the stem is. You're going to draw a horizontal line for the background of the pear. Maybe you're going to do this little line for the shadow. And then sketch a little area right here for that highlight. Sketch an area for where the red is. Sketch a little shape where the shadow is. And then you're done. And if you want to do this with a pear or something like that, that's perfectly great. But when you look at this, don't look at it to make something that's realistic. Again, that's not what this exercise is. We're not interested in realism. But as you look at this, start thinking of it not as a pear, but as a collection of different shapes of color. Like this, I see this red area or orange area. I see this dark green area here. I see this light pale green area here. And I see this kind of scoop shape of a light to medium green. So I'm concentrating on the shapes of the color field. And I only want you to do your best to focus on 4 principal different colors or color shades. Not an awful lot. Now, on the rest of this, you can do a black stem, black background, white tabletop, and a gray shadow. Those aren't really colors. But if you wanted to just do a painting of that pear itself, you could do that too. You don't have to do the setting that it's on or anything like that if you don't want to. Then what you're going to be doing is concentrate on one color at a time. Prepare your paint for that color, and instead of doing smooth strokes, do dabs. You can do dots. A lot of the times if you have a brush where the hair is in the shape of a long rectangle, that works really good. If it's round, you can do dots. If it's square, you can do, you can make different shapes if you want. But to dab the paint down, move so that the hairs of your brush lay the paint down on their side, not on the tip. And that'll give you a little bit broader area to work with. And you can smear it around a little bit if you want to, that's fine. But you're concentrating on generating fields of different colors and different color value, not on creating a pear. All right? What you need to do after that, you do that with one color, wipe your brush off a little bit on a paper towel or something, do that with the second color, do that with your 4 colors and values. And then go back and work each of them a little bit. And you can even get the paints dirty, cross-pollinate them a little bit, put a little dab of one color in the other area, but smear it around. Make sure that you're smearing and dabbing, playing with the color areas, and color and cover the whole surface of the paper with your pigment. Don't worry about getting it to look like a naturalistic pear or apple or whatever like that. You are engaged in creating a visual texture for each of the color areas that you have picked out in your sketch of the object. All right, does that make sense? I don't want you to stress about making this look right. I don't think that's an appropriate word for this setting because we're looking at exploring a technique. You will get full points if you engage this intentionally, seriously, and put your time into it. I think that you could do this reasonably well in about 1.5 hours to 2.5 hours. If you only spend 10 minutes on it, I would not recommend turning that in. You could even let that dry and paint over it, and that would be just fine. But I want you to spend a bit of time on this exploring how the paint feels as it leaves your brush, exploring the different kinds of shapes of paint dabs or dots that you can make with your paintbrush, and exploring how you can generate different energies with the visual texture you use to apply the different fields of color. So enjoy that. You can even watch videos on YouTube if you want about Impressionists, how Impressionists do their painting and stuff like that. But if you choose to do that, try not to let the videos intimidate you. Now I'm going to stop sharing. All right. I hope that that really helps to explain what Impressionism is a little bit as we look forward. There are different artists that did different things, have different takes on Impressionism. But as you look at Impressionist painters, you can see this commonality where they were generally using dabs of paint. They were generally not trying to be clean and realistic in the portrayal of something. They generally were experimenting with color use and playing with brighter colors. And you can see this kind of commonality of energy that they have as they were applying their paints in new and innovative ways. So I hope you enjoyed that. And if you have any questions, email me. But I look forward to seeing you again next week. And I hope you guys have a great week between now and then.